Tyler Mannion, thankful to be joined by DA Billy Joe Nelson Jr. and Lori Bayou. You might remember or have recognized these two folks from the Nicholas Kassotis trial that wrapped up just a few weeks ago in the Coastal Empire. Obviously, it was a high-profile case. We covered it a lot here in WTOC, as did some national media outlets, including Court TV. For those that don't remember, folks watching right now, this was a very graphic case, a very sad case where a woman was dismembered and murdered. When you're going through and prosecuting a case like this, Lori, how is it emotionally when you're dealing with such fragile details?
It's not easy. I think people are oftentimes mistaken. They think that prosecutors, law enforcement in general, don't feel some of the things that maybe the average person would feel. We absolutely do. And it's incredibly important to make sure that when we communicate with the family, friends, witnesses, that you keep that in mind, which is why it was such a focus for us to be careful with the photographs in this case.
DA Nelson, obviously, as your office is leading this kind of a prosecution and you are overseeing evidence like this that is so vivid and graphic and horrible to look at, how do you go about being delicate with that, but also realizing that that might play to your advantage with the jury for them to see really what happened to this poor woman?
So it's something that we have to balance through the course of a trial. You want to tell the full story by showing a jury all of the relevant evidence. So in a case like this, you did have very, very graphic, detailed photographs. You had some really gruesome facts that were involved. We have to make sure that we're telling a full picture and a full story to the jury to make sure that they get the feeling of what exactly happened in a case like this, because otherwise it's really not fair to the whole process. It's very important to go through all of the evidence that's relevant and to be mindful also, though, that you do have family members of a victim that are also watching what's going on. The last memories of Mindy Medvin in this case that we wanted the world to see and her family to see were not these photographs. She was a beautiful, young, vibrant young lady. So while telling the story, we also take into account the effects that it'll have long term on some of the other people involved.
In our interview, just like this one with the defense attorney here, he mentioned that in his belief this was circumstantial evidence, obviously, which you can convict on and build a case on, but that he believed there wasn't exactly that smoking gun. There wasn't exactly something definitively a murder weapon. As you're building a case around that with so-called circumstantial evidence, how is that different and how do you deal with that in this case in particular to make sure that that jury can still see the facts as you're perceiving them?
Well, so in every case, it would be wonderful if I had a crime committed on either a video evidence or with an eyewitness that's going to come forward and say, I saw the defendant commit X act. We did not have that in this case, but I do believe that the evidence, although circumstantial, was incredibly compelling and very overwhelming in volume. Nicholas Kassotis purchased the exact knife type that was found at the crime scene. It was literally purchased 8:46 in the morning, and we had evidence of the FBI tracking the CAS team, Special Agent Bernie from the FBI, went through all of the phone records to be able to track his purchase of the knife from his home to Home Depot, all the way down to where her body was discovered and recovered, the knife present at that location, and then him coming back. He had absolutely no ties to that area. He had no reason to be there. And then all of the evidence that came in surrounding that just further substantiated each and every one of those allegations as to why would Nicholas Kassotis be exactly where her remains were found.
When we look back at the trial that was, one of the seminal moments in a case, if a defendant takes the stand, is always when the defendant takes the stand. Nicholas Kassotis gets up there in his own defense. What were you strategically thinking as that happened, that you needed to get out of your cross there?
So when a defendant chooses to testify, that in and of itself is usually uncommon. It's not usually in a defendant's best interest to testify, and as a result, more often than not, defense attorneys are able to convince their client that that's probably not in their best interest. Mr. Kassotis was particularly interesting in that he himself was an attorney and a former prosecutor. So it didn't seem prudent from my perspective to get into kind of an argument contest with him. That was not going to be productive, and it's also not appropriate. But what I was hoping to accomplish was to get him to admit as much of the evidence as I could that he could not dispute. So he admitted to purchasing the knife. He admitted that it was him on the surveillance video. He admitted it was his vehicle, that he was the operator of the vehicle, that he drove the car, that it wasn't somebody else that had stolen his car or something of that nature, that somebody stole his wallet, but in fact that it was him. So at that point, once he admitted that all of those pieces of the puzzle were him, it then left the jury with only a very small decision, in my opinion. And that was simply, did he do it? Because all of the circumstantial evidence that we were saying demonstrated it, he basically admitted to.
After you go through the entire argument, and Dan Nelson, maybe this is a question more for you, the maybe not pressure is the best word, but the build-up to a verdict and then a sentence. How are you feeling in those moments, and then right after, when you do get the conviction and then you get the maximum sentence?
So I was there for the entire trial. I sat on the front row, right behind the prosecution table, behind ADA Bayo and Chief ADA McConnell. Mindy's family was behind me on the next row. There is no way to describe the emotion and the feeling that you have when you're waiting on a jury verdict. A lot of prosecutors will say, and I do believe this, the day that you're not nervous about a verdict is probably the day you should stop doing this job. Yeah. Because no matter how strong your evidence is, jurors sometimes are unpredictable. So you don't know how cases are always going to turn out. This case, I felt very comfortable that the evidence was overwhelming and more than sufficient to get a guilty verdict in this case. I think that our team did a fantastic job, everyone that was involved. So when the case went to the jury, I was comfortable we would get a guilty verdict. When we found out that a verdict had been reached, as in any other case, I was nervous. There was some anxiety that set in. But to hear the announcement from the clerk of court that the jury did reach that guilty verdict was overwhelming in a way because of the magnitude of the case, but at the same time, it's so deeply satisfying to see a victim receive the justice they deserve. And the victim's family, knowing that Mr. and Miss Mebane and her family members and friends cared so much about her and were there every step of the way during the trial, to see them finally have that moment where they can exhale is something that you really cherish in this job, because that's what this is about. It's not about us. It's about getting justice for victims and their families.